All right, so welcome to Dive into World Building. I'm just going to do my little functional thing of going into YouTube and making sure that it's going to be very quiet while we chat. And after I've done that, then we're going to start talking about institutions. Because like institutions, right? They're so exciting. I'm sure they're not very exciting. Hi, Kimberly, thanks for coming.
Sure.
So I was thinking about institutions today, and I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because unless you're reading, I just don't see that much awareness of the reach of institutions, and I don't see that much awareness of like the way that institutions kind of tacitly set up rules, and how those affect characters' lives in stories. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think it kind of depends on how you define institution as well, right? I mean, you've got stuff in fantasy like thieves guilds, right, which are basically institutions. But it's
like
and all of cyberpunk is like
yes. I was going to say 1984, and like the sort of when there's a corporate entity running things. So I see that quite a bit.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett's Discworld is full of institutions. And he explicitly has them alter the story in ways, obviously, that ours do too, which is lovely. And I would also point out The Expanse is very much about that, about
institutions and how they sometimes butt heads very violently.
Yep.
Earth, Mars.
And what happens when the people who have the upper hand don't? This season is about what happens when you're at the bottom of the gravity well.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think the power is? So yeah, that's a whole bunch of stuff.
So I guess one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is because I think that I am not familiar with a lot of those things that you just mentioned. Which may be why I'm like, there isn't enough of this, but I think there still isn't enough of this. I mean, I look at, for example, Star Trek.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we have the Federation and, and then we have the Klingons or whatever. And so there are institutions there, but I feel like
they're out of the way.
We don't have OSHA.
Do you remember that we had this one discussion? Well, we've mentioned OSHA a few times for sure, but we did have this one discussion called exploring the implications of your speculative concept.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I really enjoyed that discussion. So if you happen to be watching right now, go find that discussion because it was really cool. But I think we need a little bit more exploring the implications of your institutions as well.
And I think that people do things with institutions without knowing that they're doing it. The Hunger Games. I don't even remember what the name of that author is. Go you, whoever that is.
Suzanne
but thank you. She never, as far as I know, thought about, explored, or understood the implications of her putting all of the people of color in one district and it being the worst district. Like, there's no awareness of that in the writing at all. But boy, is it there. And I noticed it on the first read through.
Yeah.
And further versions of that, the what are those? What are the two knockoffs to that?
There's plenty of knockoffs.
Mazes something. No, not
Divergent.
What?
The Maze Runner?
The Maze Runner, yeah. That one just took care of it by not having any of that at all. But yes, you start noticing. I start noticing that there are large blank spots in the world building because if you think about the implications of how this would have had to arise.
Yeah.
The building blocks for it aren't there, and then the whole thing doesn't hold together as one tapestry.
Because if you had you'd have to put effort in to get all the people of color into one district, and there would be signs of that everywhere.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a massive undertaking that takes a lot of people, resources, and will to do.
Mhm.
Right.
And
And
it-
it
we don't
affects
see that.
people.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's not a simple process. I mean, in our own history, think of like say the Trail of Tears, for example, and the
Mhm.
devastation that caused for Native Americans getting shunted out of the Southeast and into Oklahoma of all places, and the
Yeah.
devastation that caused.
Mhm.
Yeah. And also the Civil War, which is kind of stamped in everything that we do.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, you can use that consciously, like to pick up on Paul's example. A friend of mine was asking because we were looking at where the Dene people are, and they're in like Saskatchewan, which I was surprised about, and then in Arizona, Oklahoma, like that area. But
Mhm.
in the center of the country, they're missing. And I was like, why are they missing? Well, they're missing for exactly that. The Trail of Tears, moving people out, that's kind of what happened and why they're not there. So I actually think there's a huge opportunity for people when they write a story where a group is not there, at least have the background, if not written, at least well thought out, so
Mhm.
that you know where the other bits are of your foreshadowing or side shadowing, whatever it is you're doing, are
Side
going to be
shadowing.
coming from. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's going to have ripples in the world. You don't have to tell them this entire part of the story, but pieces
Well,
of
it's a historical foundation thing in part,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Changing the world that way implies an institution that caused that. I mean, institutions can be smaller than just government-sized entities. I was thinking of institutions, well, since we talk about the 19th century, the railroads were a
Mhm.
big institution across the American West, and what influences they had on
Mhm.
communities and
Sure.
changing
And like
demographics, the power they
bringing
wielded.
people in to build their railroads.
Right.
Yeah.
The importation of lots of Asian Americans, the
Mhm.
driving
Mhm.
driving Native Americans off their land, the
Yep.
struggles with ranchers and farmers. So a big institution like that. I mean, institutions have weight, and the larger the institution, the more impact it's going to have on your world.
Mhm.
I mean, you can go to the small scale, like say a guild in a city is not just a neat place to have characters. The guild's going to do things and have actions and have
Right. It's going to have
consequences.
policies too.
It's got policies and politics.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you think about, think about SUFWA, right?
Mm.
It's an institution,
Yep.
Sure.
and its membership is, I don't know, it's not huge. Like, it's not a massive institution. On the other hand, when Alan Dean Foster starts having a problem with Disney, they
Yeah.
have policies. They get involved. They're like, hey guys,
And they're good at it.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And that is the role of that institution, for one
Mhm.
thing. But like you'll find that there are institutions out there that you might not know are there, but they will pop up because it will be like, somebody will have jurisdiction here or there.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting to look at it. When you look at a lot of the big things that have occurred, it's rare that they're, it's a single individual or a small group that has caused them. There's almost always institutional involvement somehow,
Mhm.
whether it be institutional involvement, with regards to, drumming up votes in Hell's Kitchen, or whether it be institutional involvement with displacing entire populations from their historical lands. I mean, you
Mhm.
even have things like the East India Company, right?
I was just thinking, as you were saying that, I was like thinking East India. Yeah.
I mean, they practically owned the waterways for decades, right? If you wanted to get stuff moved from landmass A to landmass B, you went through these guys.
Mhm.
And they're part of the reasons certain resources were available at certain times in certain places in the world. They
Mhm.
controlled all of this. Christopher Columbus was arguably looking for an alternate route because
Get away from
all
that.
of those waterways, I mean, that's
Mhm.
literally world changing, right? I mean, the fallout from that single event has spanned hundreds of years.
Yep.
but it's, you know, but there's a group. I mean, we give credit to a single individual a lot of times, right?
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
usually there's, you know, there's groups, there's institutions, there's monarch money, there's funding, there's, you know, armies behind these actions.
You know, this is actually, there's a really interesting thing that I want to make sure we bring up here, which is that very often there will be a sort of fundamental premise built into a particular institution that's not necessarily easily detectable.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about, you know, the interests of monarchs and the reasons why they gave people money for certain things. Whether money makes you beholden, because they, you know, like in modern politics, actually, I see very often people just simply assuming that if you have received money from a particular group, that means that you've been bought off by that group. Now, I don't
Mhm.
think that that's necessarily the case for all politicians. But you do kind of have to think about where those things are. And for example, for-profit healthcare, right, has some very basic premise problems.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If you want to, you know, what is your goal and what is the goal of the institution, and how is that institution set up, and is the way that they're set up consistent with the goal that should be their goal, right?
Mhm.
Because in my view, at least, profit should not be the goal of healthcare. The goal of healthcare should be public health.
Yeah.
Kate.
Okay.
Kate's into public health. But anyway, so the expert here. But I don't necessarily want to get you onto it.
Well, but there's that whole thing of, again, people not really thinking through the implications. I think the opening set piece of The Expanse is someone getting like his arm amputated, and then they're sitting around talking as they're kind of like sewing it. They're sitting around talking about what kind of prosthesis he can afford
Mhm.
and what he's going to get. And I'm like, okay, so
And it's very matter of fact too.
yes,
It's scary clinical. It's, oh yeah, look, it was your turn to lose your arm this week.
uh-huh,
You know, here's your selection of replacement options, and like just
yep.
rolling with it.
And also, so we are replicating this system where people without a lot of money can't get the really good prostheses either. And like, this is the same sort of capitalism in space. And
Mhm.
The Expanse is really, 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 really a lot about that. I think they thought very carefully about
Oh
their
yeah.
what
Oh,
they
yeah.
were doing. Actually,
Yeah.
I talked to one of those guys fairly often, and yeah, he did. But it's just I think that a lot, when they're looking at that piece of media, I think a lot of people miss that, those
Mhm.
little subtle things of, yes, exactly the same. It's exactly the same as it was. The way that belters are treated,
Mhm.
they're very much the new others.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that's what science fiction gets to do, right? More so than in almost any other form of literature. Is they get to take an existing system, take it off world so that we can all pretend that it's not real. And then you can take a good, serious look at the problems. But the other side of that problem is you end up, in order to transplant, you end up oversimplifying
Yeah.
as well, right? So while it's good to examine high concepts, and there's a lot of work, like if you look at Strauss's economic drill downs in some of his science fiction about fast money versus slow money and the way the economics are going to work when you're traveling billions of light years. But it's the same kind of thing, though. There's only so deep you can go because all of the substructure doesn't get transplanted with it.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, so Varan is basically like a giant construction of lots of institutions and lots of nested institutions, and and I'm trying my best to think through implications, which is one of the reasons why I have to pause before I write anything. I got to think,
Sure.
okay, what are the players here? What are the premises that are coming to play in this particular piece? I'm currently writing a part where police come to someone's door,
Mhm.
right? And so I was like, okay, what institutions are we dealing with here? Is this the police? It's actually not. So it's not going to work like the police. It's going to work like something else. And so I look around. So I went to the ACLU website to see what their recommendations were for people when the police come to their door. And that was really eye-opening. I mean, I've seen it hinted at a lot, you know, in various contexts online, but that was really very interesting, and I highly recommend it. But the place that I ended up finding the biggest parallels was actually like mining towns, where there's a company store, and the company runs
Pinkertons,
everything and
yeah.
owns everything and indebts you to them, you know, inevitably and forever and ever. Yeah.
And then you're making me think of the reverse now. Like, for example, the small institutions that grew up with the the Occupy places and like say Portland and Seattle when they were occupying areas, and they had, I mean, they had to organize and come up with their own institutions to actually get their little communities actually to function. I mean, or how people come together, like say after the 1906 earthquake, for example, and how San Franciscans had to band together and basically rebuild institutions from the ground up as collective action, the power of more people working together than a single person.
That's really interesting, because that gets me onto the question of post-apocalyptic stories. And the question of like prepping and stuff, because one of the memes that floated around when COVID started was, you know, that actually it's not the rugged individualists hiding in their bunkers who are going to get things done in the apocalypse. It's all the people sewing masks in their homes and sending them to people. And it's just how people band together and how people create support structures and institutions when their normal support structures and institutions have fallen apart.
I mean,
Right.
we see also, I'm suddenly thinking of the Book of Eli and how that post-apocalyptic little town is run very ruthlessly, but you have, he's not the only center power. You also have the guy that has the technology. You have the bikers that, and then of course you have the Wanderer played by Denzel Washington wandering in and causing all sorts of havoc. But this town didn't exist before the apocalypse. It had to be basically built up, and after apocalypses and after, or we have to go to fake ones. We can just think how society had to reform after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the whole rise of feudalism, like communities basically trying to build themselves together into a new social structure that hadn't existed before, and surviving, getting the daily needs of the people there going.
Yeah. Actually, the role of institutions is so fascinating, and it just struck me that one of the institutions that I hadn't been thinking about, or I should have been thinking about, so now I'm thinking about it, is like the clergy and the Catholic Church in
Catholic Church,
you know, medieval Europe and all this kind of stuff.
Information and knowledge and tradition and history and continuity. Continuity is an important thing. I mean, trying to keep things together so that you actually have a connection to the past, that's strong and important. In the church in the Western Europe provided that for hundreds of years.
Well, selectively, yes.
Selectively, yes, not in every way, but it was, I mean, it was a thin thread and didn't fulfill everything, but it was something so that they could look backwards on sometimes a very imagined past, but at least there was something there.
Well, and I think that it's important though to also, like, yes, that was absolutely a thing. And during the Middle Ages, the paucity of language of knowledge was a thing, but it was only a thing for Western Europe.
Right, right. I'm
You know,
just saying
like-
Western
like,
Europe, but
Yeah,
right.
Arabia was fine. You know,
Well,
they were doing their own thing.
right, Arabia is the interesting reverse case where you
Mhm.
have where you have them basically building a world-spanning empire out of a few tribes in a desert and having to build up the whole. I mean, they stole and borrowed lots of other things, but they had basically build those institutions from the ground themselves, which is the reverse story and a very interesting story that doesn't get
Mhm.
talked a lot about in history. How do you build an empire out of absolutely nothing? I mean, at least the Romans had a republic. I mean,
Yeah.
the Arabs did that. They just had some tribes and some cities, and that's it. They built an empire out of it. That's an
You know,
amazing
but
story.
on the other
Well, and I
hand,
feel like the Mongolians are going represent.
Okay, the Mongols are another different issue. Like, yeah, a bunch of horse archers take over half the 3/4 of Eurasia.
well, you know, people just clump up,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Yeah, but
you
yeah,
go
it's
to
just like
high
with
school,
preppers.
and what are the institutions in high school, right? Like the cliques and the this and the that,
clubs,
and
yeah.
people start defining themselves and dividing themselves, and there are, you know, racial groups, but there are also these sort of cultural groups, and then there might be a club that has a great degree of high profile influence that causes a certain kind of ripple effect across the school. You know, people just clump up.
Well,
Well,
but I
and
think
that's
there's
overlaid upon the resources that you do or don't have. I'm thinking about the 3rd and 4th century, where we were looking at people starting to trade tin, which is not evenly laid across the planet.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you have all these groups of people, but only a couple of them have the stuff that you need. So we need to. One person can't, you know, build a boat and make dinner on the same day. You end up
In the same,
end up having to stratify, because some people have to stay home and do the things, and some people have to go over here and do the things, and you know, not everybody makes moccasins well, and like, so it's replicated in so many ways that we need to have more than one person to in order to make the society happen. And if you don't know that I have a huge amount of contempt for libertarians, there it is. Okay.
Well, I was thinking about the libertarians and the whole myth and idea of the individual person being able to
Yeah.
do everything. The
Heirs,
Hymenian,
man.
exactly.
What were
This-
you going to say,
this
Mark?
is what-
I want to hear.
Humans are a social species really means.
Yes.
It's not it's not just about having to go touch other people. It's that you need other people so that you can eat and be safe and have shelter and all of the things.
Stability.
Yeah. And
Although arguably, I think that we underplay how we are unsafe because we are a social species. The vast majority of people die because of encounters. The vast majority of people who die because of encounters with other animals die because of encounters with other people.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then the risk of people that you know is so much higher
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
than the risk of from strangers. Yeah.
Completely opposite of what we actually believe.
Yeah.
Mhm. So yeah, there's a whole, I think there's a whole thing about how self-aware your society is, as well as how self-aware your institutions are. And now that I say that, I don't know that I've ever heard any, I don't think I've ever read anything like that.
Like what? About self-aware institutions, you mean?
Sort of how institutions can be self-aware as they are affecting the society that they are a part of.
Mm.
Well, that gets us into conspiracy theory territory and the Templars and
Illuminati,
this
yeah.
secret society has been guiding mankind towards goodness knows what for 1,000
No.
years, and they've pretty much just cocked it up since the word go. But
I want my gold
But you-
submarine.
Yeah, but you
Just as
don't
anyone could
even
stay that
need
organized.
that just to be aware of, not aware of, affecting the whole world, but aware of your institution's effect and the expanse of it. It's, because there are ripple effects. You may only have an effect on a small area or a small group of people, but that effect will, I mean, it's real. And the
Mhm.
people that you have affected, the area that you've affected will expand and affect other people who will turn around and affect other people or other institutions. So it's being aware of how it fits into the system, being aware that there is that it's a complicated system with a lot of moving parts.
Well, rather than maybe thinking of the person who's going to do the thing as being the chosen one because of their genetics, have them be the chosen one because their community is being subsidized by a separate community that has more resources, and this person just happens to have whatever talents it takes to leverage that in a way that other people don't. But it doesn't have to be because they are the son of Gog.
This kind of puts me in mind of fixer characters that pop up in fiction, right? Characters who know where the bodies are buried. They know who has a budget this year and who doesn't have a budget, and whose nephew has, a drinking problem and can be leveraged to solve this particular problem, or to give up the keys to the Lamborghini so you have an escape car or something. But it's interesting though, those characters who are really good at leveraging institutions and sort of working the systems are often secondary characters.
Mhm.
Exactly. Yes, Morgan, Mr. Kaplan in The Blacklist is a perfect example of that. There's a great character in Person of Interest as well, whose name I forget, that would show up. Or, something like, what was the show that they just had out? Oh, it wasn't called The Fixer. It was called, I forget, something similar. But it was same kind of thing, a mover and shaker who is good at leveraging that institutional knowledge.
Mhm.
Was
Well,
the main character.
You're making me think of current well, you're making me think of California politics of the last 20 something years.
Mhm.
Anywhere that you have term limits, what you have is basically people pretending that institutional knowledge has no value.
Yes.
And it's incredible. It's an incredible problem
Sure.
for keeping the government running in an appropriate
Mhm.
manner.
But in those cases, the institution lives on, right? I mean, you have a percentage, right? The higher ups tend to get swapped out. You have some movement, but there is a usually a very large body of personnel and process
Mhm.
that remains from, elected official to elected official to elected
Right.
official.
So
So
Usually.
instead of the elected official having most of the power shifts over to non-elected bureaucratic team
Mhm.
members.
Right,
Yeah.
right. The careerists, and like that's the case like in Washington, like
Well, and lobbyists for
yeah,
goodness
and
sake.
lobbyists from the
Mhm.
outside who know more
Oh my
than
God.
the Congress people do about a particular subject. Or at least they're interested in it and end up writing
what books are-
legislation.
You know what books are about institutions?
Mm.
Bujold. That is
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Started reading her, yeah.
Say
What
again?
is it?
Yeah.
Bujold.
Yeah.
Just,
Lois McMaster Bujold.
Oh,
The
yeah,
the Costigan books in particular.
yeah. The oh yeah, Barriar is.
Lydia,
just
you
got-
gonna say something, sweetie?
yeah, I just got my copy of Barrier, actually. It's on the kitchen table. My family has been trying to get me to read it for my whole life, so I'm finally getting around to it. But I was also going to mention, my sister was making me watch this kind of old television show, Yes, Minister. Does it
Yes.
Yeah.
and this was just reminding me of that, where the assistant Humphrey is basically the one who's really controlling everything that happens, because the minister is just figuring everything out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep, Sir Humphrey. Yeah, his loyalty is to continuity of his office and not to the minister himself. So the minister
Yeah.
is-
Well, it occurs to me that probably British media has more of this than ours does,
Mm,
because
Mhm.
they've been committed to that for a much longer time than we have. I mean, even The Crown does this.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a whole bunch of that. And I've worked for people who have worked for both sides, like, in a civil servant position. And yeah, governors come and go, doesn't matter what party they are, they keep still there doing their job. And yeah, that's a thing.
well, so I had another thought a couple minutes ago when Kimberly was talking about Templars.
Uh-oh.
But I think it's worth mentioning. So the conspiracy theorists like to imagine large-scale institutions that nobody can see, but a lot of us, and not just conspiracy theorists, like to ignore the really, really obvious networks that everybody can see, like the Old Boys Network, for
Mhm.
example,
Sure.
aka the patriarchy,
Yeah.
right? But again, this operates so often in politics, but the way that the defeat of Hillary Clinton was set up over 25 years
Mhm.
by a very specific group of people with a very specific kind of agenda. And everybody's like, no, that's not happening. Like, does that make sense? So when I'm talking about institutions and their invisibility, I'm not necessarily talking about the institutions like the Templars, which, they're invisible because actually they aren't a thing. But
Willful
we have
blindness.
these things that we just kind of either take for granted or deliberately turn our eyes away from because they make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, institutional racism is something that Americans
Absolutely.
in particular do not want to take a look at in the main. Like,
Mm-mm.
that doesn't exist. Nope, we're past that. We're not
I
racist
don't like
anymore.
political science fiction.
Yeah,
Right?
Kate, I like the Secret Society of Midwives. I think this is a good plan.
Okay, I'll work on that. I have a friend who's a midwife, so I'm like good to go. But
You
yeah,
got the insider track.
Poisoning was totally a thing.
it was totally a thing. There was just a story about the famous Italian woman who was known for her poisons, because that's how it, and there's all of, I keep seeing these
The woman who would hide the poisons in makeup.
no, but that's a great one.
Oh yeah.
that's-
So there was this woman who was known as a makeup purveyor, when actually what she was doing was selling people the means to poison their husbands. Yeah.
I like
I can't
Yeah, I think
remember the
there's
name, but like go look it up.
society-
It was amazing.
secret societies of women that do whatever those things are. I mean, one of the things that you can do is like if you have commensals of some sort, if you're breeding horses or whatever, the people that you don't like have bad farms
Mhm.
because you refuse to breed them good animals.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. It's sort of a gate to women's country, but writ further in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's also about which institutions control which resources too.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, when it comes to secret societies, at least in the real world, I've been very disappointed.
Yeah.
Because there are some really fun ones. There's the ones everyone's heard of that aren't really that secret, like the Oddfellows and the Masons.
Mhm.
But there's no secret society where I'm like, ooh, I would totally join that tomorrow. There's like that really, the one with the risque name, like the Order of the Garter, where you're like, oh, okay, at least you have a fun backstory, sort of. But there's like very little out there for women. Is
Yeah.
I guess where the Bene Gesserit and Dune and that sort of mysticism becomes more appealing. And most of the ones that are public, you have to be like some kind of deist to get in. You have to be like Christian or something like that.
Yeah,
So-
like nunneries and stuff. That's what comes to mind for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the clergy used to have a huge amount of say in society, and a lot of it was economical, but and this is part of that, overall hierarchy thing of yes, there were women who had power, they didn't have as much, but they did have some.
Mhm. And knew
Um,
how to use what they had.
yes. Yes. Yeah, we need more of those.
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think history is such a rich source of ideas, and that people who are writing stories, whether they're taking place in past, present, or future, they should be looking at history and the news and things that happen.
Mhm.
Because there's so much there.
Oh yeah, there's so much stuff that I don't even like. I didn't realize that the Pharaoh stole Alexander's body and no one ever found it. Alexander the Great.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ptolemies. Yeah.
Yeah,
They-
Ptolemy, that guy.
Yeah, they snatched the body, and that was the end of that.
Yeah. Don't know where we're ever gonna find it. Nothing. Just wacky. So yeah, there was a whole bunch of sort of soap opera-esque. I mean, history is made of people, and people are made of drama.
Oh yeah. Oh,
You
yeah.
know, and that's I love your cat.
Aw, kitty.
Sweetheart, yeah.
But yeah, it's just like one of the things when people are like, well, that is you're using dramatic license. I'm like, you have no idea how dramatic these people were in real life.
Yeah.
They
Yeah,
just,
I mean, going to an institution. I mean, after Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, the institution was basically the Macedonian military, and they had a gigantic falling out because, as institutions go, they were not very cohesive, and that's
Mhm,
why you wound up with Egypt and the Seleucids and
mhm.
the dynasty in Greece, and they all fought each other for 150 years till the Romans showed up. So yeah, so that institution failed.
Mhm.
Well, and I don't think we give enough credit to how many times we've had to redo the idea of institution. People are like, well, it's democracy is the worst thing except for all the other ones we've ever tried. Do you have any idea how many we have ever tried? Because there's a bunch.
There's a lot.
Yeah. And so, like, don't slag off on democracy just because you don't see you don't understand A, how it works, or B, how you benefit.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because yes, there were all sorts of other ways to do this, and we've kind of gone through all of them.
Everything we can think of.
Yep.
No,
But
other
there's
than
always that.
go
Oh
ahead.
no, go ahead. Sorry. There's always that one person who's like, well, yeah, but if we tried communism, but
Yes.
with bears, like, there's always like a but with, right? Like, well,
Uh-huh.
what if we took? I mean, China's doing this right now, but what if we took capitalism and sprinkled it with? Actually, let's take communism and sprinkle it with capitalism, really, and see if something better comes up. But the mashups don't do any better at the end of the day, right?
No.
They become boat cars
Yeah. Well, and I think
Or
that
car planes.
if
or
you're
car planes.
if your whole idea is that you would like to have a couple of people who are really rich and everybody else impoverished, it doesn't matter what dress you put on it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
stuff. That's what people are like, well, democratic socialism. Okay. Democracy is a structure, socialism is a philosophy. Both of
Yep.
those can be capitalist as hell.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know what you're really arguing against or for here, but I have a feeling we're not working with the same definitions. And that's a huge part of the issue is
Mhm.
how do we define things that are by definition different than the definitions we have. Hi, and welcome to Sci-Fi and all sorts of words we make up.
Yep.
Well, and it's interesting too when you see systems in sci-fi that if you dig into them a bit more, you realize that they're, what we would consider classically socialist systems or classically dictatorship. But we've given them a new cool, fancy name. Suddenly they're really cool.
Yep.
Like,
Tome.
yeah.
But they also tend to work a lot sort of better and more easily because we're
There's no
writing a
actual
story
people.
and we don't actually have to deal with the messiness of reality.
Yeah. The problem with 99% of systems is people.
Yep.
Strength and a
Constructing a
weakness.
system that is not subject that won't fail because of people and won't fail people because it is built so that it can't be abused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not.
That's
That's
like
kind of the
quote-
holy grail, right?
That
The
takes us
unabusable
back to that whole
system.
question of underlying premises behind institutions.
Yeah.
Well, and that quote by the Yellowstone park ranger, who when asked why they can't make garbage receptacles that are not openable by bears, they said, well, the space where the smartest people, the dumbest people and the smartest bears is considerable overlap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems that we're going to have with robots too. Like, trying to make those laws of robotics is that we've been trying to make laws for 10,000 years. How good are we at it?
Mixed record.
Yeah. Work in progress.
Well,
It's been interesting to be watching Star Trek Discovery because, that's always this really idealized institution, the Federation. But they're kind of playing right now with like the mirror universe at the same time. And they're both exaggerated, right? The Federation is what we would be at our best, although in this season there's like logistical issues that are preventing that. But it's really curious just to see both of them as foils and to imagine that we're starting from the same place. But ultimately, you need a government that assumes both the best and the worst of people in some ways. Something that's practical enough that it takes into account both the carrot and the stick, I guess, if that makes sense.
I mean, we even see this in software systems, right? You have to, at some point, every engineer designing a system is very idealistic and is like, okay, this is how it's going to work. It's going to be wonderful. And then the UI designers and the producers come in and say, well, what about all these bad actors over here? And the engineers go, nobody would ever do that. Why would anybody subvert this fabulous piece of engineering for personal gain? But there's like a whole vertical job stack that is designed for, for looking for ways bad actors can exploit those systems. Because on the one side, you have the people who design it, who are the idealists. And then you have the people who have to put in all the controls, who are used to dealing with the bad actors, and you have the realists. And then somewhere in the middle of all of that, you get, something that gets released to the public that nobody's happy with, but it works.
Well,
Well,
and then you have
you know-
things like
the end
Facebook,
user
where people
interface.
probably should have done a lot more thinking about how harm could be done.
Maybe, but Facebook's an evolved, all of these evolved, right? These were all 10
Yeah.
guys in a garage banging together something that was really cool. And then it literally evolved, right? There's layers and layers and layers and layers.
Yeah.
Microsoft, same thing, Microsoft operating system. When it started out, it was, a couple of guys kit bashed this thing together and suckered someone into giving them money. And now responsibility. And some groups step up, right? And some groups, like the guys who run the Chans are like, you're on your own, folks. We built you a tool. We don't care.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
Well, and I think that one of the things that people don't want to admit is that other people en masse are all anarchists. And so, yes, there is always going to be somebody who walks up to your sandcastle and stomps on it. Always. And so
always.
build that in. I found it, speaking of being self-aware, we are not particularly self-aware of who we are as a species or a people or society or anything. But yes, I mean, I think one of the things that we learned this summer is that there's always somebody waiting to throw a wrench into the works, always, or a shoe or whatever it is. And we should be planning for that rather than just hoping it isn't going to happen this time.
Well, it's
gonna happen.
I often look at it like tiered failures, right? Like you design an ideal system and you know there's a point of failure there, but you leave it because you know where it's going to be attacked. And then you have time to to patch over that particular point of failure. And there's another point of failure over here, but you know that's what's going to be attacked next, right? So there's this evolution, right? And institutions do this too. I mean, even SIFWA just saw this, right, with the Hugo Awards, where somebody said, or not, yeah, where not SIFWA, but World says with the Hugo Awards, where someone said, well, that's not in the rules. Watch this, and said about trying to break the system. NASA did a competition for teenagers a few years ago, and had a whole bunch of kids submit videos. And then a couple of people said, hey, we want these kids to win. And they unleashed bots on the videos, because the rule was whoever gets the most views on their video wins the day. And to their credit, NASA saw this happening and shut that down really fast. But it's almost like there's a planned evolution to a lot of things, where you put it out there and you wait for it to get attacked, and then you buttress it up over here, and then you wait again, and then you buttress it up over there. The problem is eventually you get something that's so complex it's doomed to failure. Eventually, you're just trying to keep it going as long as possible, which I think suits institutions as well, right? They continue on until the top gets corrupted, or they lose their base, or they actually, which sometimes happens, they actually fix the thing they set out to fix, right? They have, eliminated malaria. Like,
that's the best.
Now what?
Out of a job.
Yeah, because that's a lot of institutions. They are literally working towards putting themselves out of a job. And a lot of them are almost, leaning towards, okay, how do we almost put ourselves out of a job, but give us enough time to pivot, right? So there's like this life cycle.
Time to pivot. Well, I mean, often you just have more than one purpose, Say, well, if we get one of these out of the way, we'll still have the other one.
Yeah, you would be amazed at how quickly that complexity ramifies.
Yeah.
Great to see you, Lydia. So I wanted to mention a couple of things. One was a thought that came up when we were talking about social media, and that was as far as exploring the implications of the institutions that you have, think about how they change the way we talk. I see linguists talking about this, but I don't see as much sort of just general public awareness of this, of how much Twitter has changed the way that we communicate.
Before that, email and
just
texting.
by making a small box and saying, no, you only have this small box, right? I mean, the whole proliferation of acronyms, and I mean, there were always acronyms, but like now everything is an acronym. Pronouns are starting to become single letters, like there are just these really broad scale changes in language that are happening because of Twitter, right? And Facebook, and like, for example, dropping pronouns, that's a thing that has started to happen a lot, because I think that when you have a little icon saying who it is that's talking at any given point, people start dropping their pronouns to try to compact it, right? So definitely that's something that I would recommend that people think about is how these institutions affect language. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was, this is going to sound selfish because it has something to do with a line that I wrote that I really liked, and Kimberly has actually read. When everything can change so quickly, what remains? And the answer to the question is, nothing remains but what we uphold. And I think it's worth talking about the roles that people play in upholding the institutions, even when they're not necessarily directly involved with them, right? Like the institution of the police, and how, the role that people who rely on the police to do their bidding because they have privilege and power, uphold that institution and make it easier for that members of the institution to be abusive, for example.
Mhm.
But
The
like,
wall of silence.
yeah, and it's that which also gives the lie to, well, they're all going to die off eventually. This institution is a thing, but those folks who believe X, Y, or Z are going to, whatever. It's not going to happen because the institution is being upheld and it is being perpetuated by the people who participate in it.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
And so whenever you're dealing with institutions in fiction, it's worth asking who's participating, what basic interest do they have in the perpetuation of the system? Do they participate in it willingly? Do they participate in it unwillingly or unconsciously? Those kinds of questions I think are really important. Because even though a lot of institutions are sort of obvious and visible, again, these implications of presence of those institutions and their reach and their influence, those kinds of things are much more likely to be invisible, and we might not see all the possible implications. I mean, how can we, right? It takes dissertations sometimes to figure all this stuff out. But it's worth thinking through that when you're working in fiction or futurism or whatever it happens to be. So I ended up shutting everyone down.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Shut everyone down.
No,
So it is 5 o'clock. We are kind of getting
Yeah.
to the end here. I was like, I gotta get this last thought in.
yeah.
So any last thoughts, things that you wanted to bring up that you may have thought of halfway through the session and didn't get a chance to say?
I've babbled too much. I'm gonna leave it to like more.
No, not at all, Paul. Not at all. Anybody else? Cool. You guys are all amazing. And I'm so happy to have had so many people here. This is going to be the last dive into world building for 2020. I'm still doing this.
You're still standing.
After everything that
This is an
2020 has
institution
thrown
that
at me, I'm still doing
continues.
this. So
You're
I'm
still
really happy
perpetuating
about
this
it.
You're still
Um,
perpetuating this institution.
I am
That's right.
perpetuating dive
And
into
we're
world building as an
upholding.
institution.
Yes,
We're upholding.
institution. We are
You guys are
complicit.
upholding. Absolutely.
Happily
I can't do
complicit.
this by myself. So we're going to reconvene in January. I will put out announcements in my various Facebook group and Discord locations to get people caught up on what I'm planning. I believe that in January we're going to be having Marie Brennan and Alyssa Helms coming to talk about their book.
Which
So
I'm
that-
reading right now.
What?
I'm reading an arc of The Mask in the Mirror right now.
There we go. The Mask of
Fabulous.
Mirrors. So it's going to be coming out. We're going to have them on and we're going to talk about it. It'll be really cool. But I don't know when that's going to happen quite yet because
And
I
they
don't
have
think
really
I have a date
interesting
tied down.
institutions in the book.
Nice institutions, everybody.
See, I'm bringing it all together.
So thank you all very, very much for supporting my show and for continuing to come and talk to me because I can't talk to myself for an hour. Well, I can, but you wouldn't want to listen. And we will resume in the new year and